Thank you for joining us for another Hagley History Hangout. My name is Gregory Hargreaves, Assistant Director of the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library in Wilmington, Delaware. Now, during these History Hangouts, we like to bring you some of the great work being done by scholars who have used the historical collections held in the Hagley Library, especially folks who have received support in the form of research grants and fellowships of different kinds from the Hagley Center. One such scholar joins me today. Courtney Slavin is a PhD candidate at Clark University. Courtney, thanks for speaking with me today.
Thank you for having me, Dr. Hargreaves. It's a beautiful morning here. I hope you're also enjoying your day there in Delaware.
Thank you. Spring has sprung. Um, let's start by painting with broad strokes, so to speak. What is it that you are researching and writing about?
So my research concerns what I would consider the emergence of a modern American gun culture. I take a different approach to looking at guns by focusing on a consumerist lens. So my work is interested in thinking of guns or the emergence of American gun culture as following alongside the rise of consumer culture in the US. So looking at the late 19th century as mass production, mass industrialization allows for, and this rise in leisure time as well allows for people to think of how they're consuming goods in a different way than they were in a pre-industrial era. And guns is one of those objects.
So you're bringing firearm history and the history of consumer culture into conversation with one another. Do I understand that correctly?
Yeah, absolutely. Typically, when guns are looked at either in the public or from previous scholars, there's been a couple of changes since then. It's typically done through a political history lens or through a history of violence lens. And so my work really is interested in kind of trying to think of guns as more expansive than that and trying to kind of get at the heart of this issue of where this gun debate, so to speak, kind of breaks down. And I think thinking of them as also consumer goods is a way to do that. And guns become imbued in or kind of entrenched in a lot of these other debates that are happening around the late 19th century. So you see the crisis of masculinity, you see the rise of conspicuous consumption. Guns are really expensive, and so they can be a sign of status. This fear of over civilization and needing to have a reprieve from urban life. And so guns can provide a way to do that. And so with all of those kind of social anxieties, what T.J. Jackson Lears has referred to as the apparent loss of hegemony, guns can become almost in a way a salve, but also a way of what I see as building community in a world where it feels like community or traditional forms of community is being defined by a physical space, starting to shift into thinking of imagined communities as the scholar Benedict Anderson would describe it.
What an interesting way to frame the subject.
Thank you.
Now, you mentioned briefly the late 19th century. What is the sort of temporal frame that you're working in?
Right. So I look at roughly the 1870s to my latest possible date is really 1920. That's when we see this rise in consumer culture really start to pick up and then peak in the 1920s. And with that, all of the institutions that are built around consumerism. So we see, these illustrious catalogs. The most famous that everyone knows about is the Sears catalog, and how advertising as a business really starts to pick up. And the department stores is a big one that people always talk about. And those conventions are being built around the same time that, again, leisure and disposable income. And what we see is these companies like Winchester, like Smith and Wesson, Remington, all of the big brand names that we know today also really start to emerge and become concentrated as unique brands as opposed to independent gun makers as well. And so I think that those conceptions of like a brand loyalty or brand identity. So, what a Winchester means versus what a Smith and Wesson means and what it says about you as a gun owner, so to speak, really start to come into presence and start to materialize at this moment. And the reason I started in 1871 is because, or 1870s, is because that's when the NRA starts. And so the National Rifle Association, through its first president, William Church, he writes in the Army and Navy Journal about the need for a program that is to promote and encourage rifle practice among the citizenry. And it really is built at that time as a desire for men to have a space of community with one another, but to imbue it with these almost Victorian virtues of discipline and what they see as kind of a manhood, restraint, and honor, so to speak, and this need for kind of a military-ish culture that again bleeds into the masculinity stuff that's happening at the same time. And so all of these pieces are happening simultaneously, and they're influencing one another. And so it's not just the NRA, they're not kind of this big puppet master, so to speak, but there's also these independent clubs that start to pop up everywhere. So I know of one in Galveston, there's one in New Orleans, there's several in Detroit, and it really is kind of these Civil War vets who are looking for a place of camaraderie that they experienced maybe during the Civil War and don't feel a space for anymore. And so they're kind of emerging at the same time. And then the NRA creates a system that can almost standardize these clubs and promote shooting competitions so that they can have competitions and tournaments with one another. And so we see this vast network of these gun clubs really starting to coalesce around or incorporate themselves around what is the NRA, but creating this national gun community almost.
This is such a provocative angle on this subject, sort of positioning gun consumption as as culturally symbolic and having that be the explanatory force behind this, as opposed to violence, which I think is actually more easily explained than what you're pointing toward, that how guns become a symbolic consumable that fit into this really complex cultural set of interplaying factors. That's really fascinating.
Thank you. Yes, I think, like you said, the violence point of it is completely understandable, and I'm fully aware that in this project there is no way to entirely divorce it from the violence of it. It's available even in the advertisements that I look at as companies begin to advertise their guns as being safe. And so not even thinking about violence as deliberate, but accidental discharge is a really problematic issue at that time. Accidents happen, and when an accident happens with a gun, it can be fatal. And so that is obviously something that cannot be taken away. But I also think it's important to recognize that consumption itself, or consumer culture, especially at this time, can be violent as well, right? This is the same time that we see Coney Island, for example, really start to come into fruition with all the amusement parks and the roller coasters, so to speak, on that case. They also have accidents. They are doing these grand shows of where they're creating displays of buildings being caught on fire, and so there is kind of this desire for a riskier spectacle. I look at the idea of spectacle and amusement as another way of thinking about guns. Another way that I think of gun consumer culture is how guns are consumed indirectly as well. So not just thinking about the consumer culture of the gun, but other ways that people are enjoying them, even if they don't have to purchase the gun themselves. And so this thinks about things like the dime novels or Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West show, right? Things where guns are the spectacle or the thing that people are coming to see, either directly or indirectly. Sorry. And there that becomes the consumerism in and of itself. And again, it's connected to community as all of these spectators are coming together to enjoy in this thing. One example that I look at is there's an international shooting competition. It's the first of its kind in 1873, where the U.S. rifle team, amateur rifle team, it's very new at that time, is competing against the Irish rifle team. And the way it's described in the newspaper is that these denim-clad Irish laborers are filling the trains to Long Island, rubbing shoulders with the cream of New York society. And so we see, even as these guns can become a delineation of class, the spectacle of it can also bring separate classes together in a really interesting way as well. And so I think it's important to complicate not only the traditional way that we think of violence in this sense, but also thinking of consumerism also being rethought as well.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, I immediately wonder how guns were advertised in this period. So advertisements and media are so integral to gun culture today in the 21st century. How did those things look in your period?
Yeah, they so similar to a lot of the other advertisements in the early 1870s, they are primarily just the object itself. And so they're often pointing to what makes that gun different than another. So if it's breech loading, which means that the ammunition is loaded in from the back of the barrel, they'll show either a long gun kind of bent in half where that can be put in. If it's a revolver, they're going to show the shotgun shells kind of falling out of the revolver itself to show that that's how it's put in. And so at first it's a lot more about that mechanical piece, and they rely a lot on the description to sell the gun. So like what it's being used for, what the value of it is. And size is really important. Color is really important, whether it's made of, if it's blued or if it's nickel, if it has a pearl or an ivory handle. They really emphasize those kinds of things. And part of that is because that's going to change the price as well. But as it moves into the 1880s, when we start to see catalogs and magazines become a lot more illustrative, and that process becomes more affordable and easier to do. They really tend to focus on these ideas of wilderness, so going out into the wilderness and shooting and in recreational hunting, right? That's a huge piece of this, but they also focus on target shooting. So they'll show, a target that was shot by Annie Oakley, for example, and they'll show where her shots were on this target. And they'll say, only Annie Oakley could do this with a Winchester 73 or whatever. And so that becomes a huge selling point as well. But what I'm interested in as well is not just the way that they're advertised, but I also am, of course, interested in the way that they're being consumed. And I think that we can get caught up, understandably, in seeing that as a one-to-one, because we often don't have the other side of that conversation. So advertisements can tell us what the manufacturer, the gun producers think is going to sell the gun. But as I imagine as well, the reason you purchase a good isn't necessarily because of what you saw on the commercial. But that second half of the conversation is a lot harder to find. And this is where the Hagley Museum really came in handy. This is what I'm really interested in, and that is that I've been able to sort of try to patchwork as best can be done with the sources that are available, to provide that other half of the conversation. So what I've been able to find is that there are plenty of gun purchasers who are writing letters to the gun makers, or in you all's case, there's a couple of gun makers, gun agents, and the DuPont Powder Company, who are writing why they're purchasing the goods that they need. So sometimes they'll just include the order, but a lot of times these people are also feeling like they need to defend their purchases, which is really interesting, or explaining why they're purchasing the goods that they are. And so what I've found is, while Winchester, so to speak, is advertising about wilderness, for example, and they're talking about, a man goes out into the wilderness with a Winchester at his side or what have you. And the image might be a moose coming toward him, charging at him, and the man has kind of fallen down, but he's still pointing his gun at the moose to save his life, so to speak. But the man is by himself almost, 9 out of 10 times. But when people are writing about these guns, this gets back to the community of it. They're often talking about other people in those letters. So one of my favorites is, there's a letter from a man by the name of W.G. Morse, and he writes to the Sharps Rifle Company about how he is disappointed with the gun that he received. And it has nothing to do with the gun's function. Instead, he writes to them that his gun is unsatisfactory because it is not as handsome as the gun that the rifle club president received. And he sees this as the fault of the Sharps Rifle Company. And so he writes to them and says, I need you to send me a gun that is of equal or better quality than President Moore's gun. And I want you to customize it to my likings. So he wants them to put an engraved nameplate on it that is bigger than the president of the rifle club's president. And then he tells the Sharps Rifle Company that because it is their fault that it is not to his aesthetic standards, it doesn't look pretty enough, they need to pay for the gun, or give him a heavy discount on it, because clearly it's their fault and not his kind of ego almost being tested. And so it's this really interesting thing that kind of pushes against what we think about when we think about guns, in that they are not entirely just about the function, but that there is an appearance, an identity, an aesthetic that becomes connected to it. And it's entirely social, right? That the desire for this gun is not because he wants to keep it to himself, but he plans on showing it to the rest of the people in his gun club. There are other elements of this, right? So some of the letters will almost feel like they need to prove themselves as a gun owner. So they'll start listing all of the other brands of guns that they've owned or that they've bought in the last couple of years, as a way to kind of prove their expertise. And so it becomes a very, very social world, which is really counter to how we think about guns in general, as often they're talked about through the lens of like a Second Amendment, or they're talked about as again, a singular hunter going off into the woods for reflection, or we think of the gun collector who maybe is hoarding guns into a shrine or some sort of gun safe just for himself. But the reality is, many people who are gun owners, and I see this still today as I talk to people about my work, is that they're enjoying guns with other people, whether that's telling them about their recent purchase, or they're going on a hunting trip together as friends or as a family, or they're going to a shooting range together and just going to talk about their enjoyment of guns, right?
Hmm. I think that's a really profound point and distinction to make there, where and it helps us begin to understand how guns become loaded with this symbolic meaning and this purpose of community. That's quite interesting. Now, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what you dug into in the Haggley collections. Perhaps what set of documents was most revelatory for you?
Right. So I'm still making my way through them because lucky enough for me, I was able to get a ton of material. And so one thing that I was particularly interested in with the Hagley is, like I mentioned, the DuPont records were helpful because they had a lot of those letters. And what that was able to telegraph to me is kind of who major purchasers are, which can kind of help point to different directions, right? So a lot of times this would be distributors. So people purchasing for they're buying kind of wholesale from DuPont to sell in their own local stores. And so that can also give a lot of clue as to who these purchasers might be, because outside of that, all I'm getting is really a name and maybe a location, but sometimes that can be a bit scarce. And so this is also showing not only where these are going in terms of local stores, but also how frequently they're having to be purchased, because ammunition, unlike guns, is something that has to be replenished over time. And so you can start to kind of see, I hope, whenever I really chart this out, kind of if there's an ebb and a flow to that purchase of ammunition. And I wouldn't be surprised if that correlates to things like economic panics. So there's one in 1893 that I could see kind of affecting that. Whereas guns are durable. You know, you buy one gun and you have it for a long time. But ammunition and things like gunpowder suggest that the need to purchase routinely or frequently can show the enthusiasm in that as a sport, I think, to kind of more narrow that. But another piece that I wasn't expecting to actually find, this is the beauty of going to the archives and looking for yourself, is I found the papers of a James Henry, who was a gun smith, gun maker as well. And so he is sending and receiving a lot of letters from these major gun manufacturers, but also, again, getting those letters from people about what they want with their guns. And because he is independent, there's a different frame that people are coming to him with. He's also getting a lot of letters from these distributors. In one of the letters I found in his work, which I haven't been able to like fully dig into yet, this particular scenario, but it talks about this customer who had, I think, like shot a friend or some capacity, or and so there's this like skirmish there about like what do we do when something like this happens, which is a similar conversation that we see when violence does happen today, around kind of responsibility and how to account for those kinds of things. But he has a lot of these same letters that I mentioned about where people are getting their guns, why they're getting them. People get really descriptive and they get very personal in these letters. And it's so interesting to me because at the end of the day, this is a stranger a lot of the time, right? They don't actually know who they're writing this letter to. And so there's this like very human impulse to present oneself in a specific way, even if you will never meet that person or talk to them again. Just the need to kind of demonstrate identity in this instance, even in a very formal business circumstance, is really fascinating. And then the other one that I was able to get to is they had several catalogs as well, which is a big piece of this. So again, making sure that it's not leaning too heavily on the letters, but there's also these catalogs and importantly, catalogs that aren't just from these major gun makers like Winchester or Smith & Wesson, but one that the Hagley had is the Great Western Gun Works, which is a retail store, sporting goods store in Philadelphia. And so making sure to get that piece of this as well, that it's not always just the gun makers or DuPont, for example, selling these goods directly to consumers, but they're often having to go through a middleman, whether it be a gun agent, so someone who works directly with the manufacturers, or a retail store, right, like a sporting goods, or one of my other favorites to look at is Abercrombie and Fitch. Before they were, you know, shirtless guys in the mall that we think of today, they were a legitimate sporting goods store, particularly for an elite class of, you know, Wall Street men basically in New York in the 1890s, early 1900s. And I think that piece of this is also really important. And so the Hagley had several of those retailers catalogs as well, which has been absolutely instrumental and helpful.
It sounds like you really found the juice, the stuff that's super useful to the researcher and really hard to find, especially consumers explaining their thoughts behind consumption. That's really hard to track down. It sounds like you've really nailed it here.
Yeah, the phrase I've been using is it is a lot of haystacks. And the needles, sometimes there's very few needles, sometimes the whole thing is needles. But because the project is very new, or the way I'm thinking about this hasn't, to my knowledge, really been done, especially to this extent. It's understandable that the archives are not, cataloging for that framework. They're going to have a Smith and Wesson collection, but it might mostly be business records because understandably people want to know about the business history of that. Whereas mine is maybe people are just thinking, well, it's an order for one gun, it's an order for 1,000 rounds of ammunition or cartridges, and not really knowing that there is a story that's happening behind a lot of those orders that are being sent in.
Dare I call it a smoking gun?
Hey, sounds good to me. Write that down. That'll be chapter 5.
There we go. Well, it also seems like your work has a lot of rather profound implications for the present, especially where not only gun violence is increasingly common in our society in the United States, but also the culture, the cultural resonance, cultural potency of the symbol of the gun has lost none of its strength. If anything, it seems to have gotten um, more so. Um, Perhaps is there a way your project, I know you're not done yet, but is there a way perhaps your project speaks to the present and perhaps even provides us with a sense of guidance?
Absolutely. That is both the kernel that sits at the base of this project as well as the greatest thorn in its side, because it is incredibly relevant. So this project began when I was in Worcester, Massachusetts, which is where Clark University is. And Massachusetts is not nearly as gun centric as where I'm from originally, which is Texas. And that's not to say that there aren't shooters and hunters in Massachusetts. There definitely are, but they're not as prominent, I guess, in society or in the culture as they are in Texas. And then in Texas, the gun rights issue is for many people first and foremost. But while I was in Worcester, I felt powerless essentially when a school shooting at Santa Fe High School happened about a mile away from where my niece goes to high school. And feeling, being 1,500 miles away from my family when an event like that happens can be really disarming. And I just remember, kind of sitting and asking, like pleading, being like, how did we get here? And it was that emotional question that really thrust this project, where I kind of scrapped all of what my previous desire for a dissertation was going to be and moved in this direction. And part of it is because of my own agony around this gun violence issue, but it's also because of the breakdown of conversation around it. So I try to emphasize part of the reason I don't focus on the politics and part of the reason I don't focus on the violence is because to me, it seems like when those two pieces get infused into this, and they can't be taken out, but everyone kind of shuts down
Hmm.
the conversation. And so the coming from a gun owning family as well, but also being in an academic space, which is very typically apprehensive about the idea of guns, understandably, allows, I think, a new perspective in terms of understanding guns and the kind of deep affection that people hold them with, and trying to understand the gun owner specifically. Because the reality is the majority of guns in the US, there's 400 million plus, I believe, at this point. They're not used violently. And so, but it doesn't mean that there's not a problem with that, or with them in how they're regulated in general. And so part of this is to try to create a common understanding of how people are thinking about guns, and understanding where this culture comes from. How did we get here? How does this become a problem that is incredibly unique to the United States in terms of, the developed world? Because there are other countries that have a history of a similar gun culture. As I mentioned, there's an Irish rifle team, which shows that Ireland has their own version of it. England has their own version of it. I was speaking to someone at a conference this past weekend who's from Sweden, and he was telling me about the Swedish gun culture. And so there are other forms of gun culture as well, but the American one is really distinct, and it departs in a really interesting way. And I'm not sure how much of that is in my period. There is a compelling argument that a lot of the self-defense, so to speak, gun rights conversation really begins in like the 1950s, 1960s. And there's a wonderful historian who's been doing the work on that. His name is Drew McKevitt, with his book, Gun Country. But I think that before we can get to the 1950s, 1960s self-defense piece, we have to understand when they become a consumer good to begin with, because you don't see this really emotional connection to guns in the pre-industrial period. And so we have kind of this myth in the US that the US has always been a gun culture. And I push back on that, not to say that obviously guns are there, but I think in order to have a culture that is focused on a singular object or good, you need to have two pieces of it, right? It needs to be an object that has community around it, and there needs to be consumer choice. And so because of that, in the same way we don't have a consumer culture of shovels, so to speak, or pots and pans, right? These are things that are ubiquitous. Everybody has them, and yet they don't have the same cultural significance because they're tools first, or their necessities first. And so I think that's why I focus on the 1870s, is because that's largely when guns shift from being an object of production, something people are using to protect their homestead, something people are using to protect their homes, or their livestock, whatever it might be, to something that people are enjoying for the sake of enjoying the object. And so that shift to consumption, I think, is when it gets imbued with all of that cultural significance as well. And so because of that, so to get back to your point about the relevancy of it today, I think a lot about how that consumerist community has continued. And to your point, right, the use of the image of a gun, so to speak, or the silhouette of a gun in a lot of consumer products. So I think of Black Rifle Coffee Company, right? That this is a product that does not sell guns at all, but uses the imagery of a gun to indicate their participation in a very unique community, and as a champion of that community. And of course, there's the political implications in that, as well, as it has become greater or more involved in the political side of things. But this seeing the decals on trucks, especially here in Texas, it's very prominent of people kind of displaying their participation in a gun owning community in ways that they're not doing in the 1870s, partially because they don't have cars to put decals on. They aren't wearing t-shirts with a gun or pro Second Amendment shirts because it's just not a thing that exists at that time. And so the identity of being a gun owner kind of exist in physical space exists with carrying the gun or being at the shooting range. And so outside of that, or maybe having the gun above your mantelpiece in your home, but it's a very kind of static status that unless you know the person, you can't tell a stranger whether or not they're a gun owner at that time or they're participating in that system in the way that you can now. Because and it's not everyone, right? There's still plenty of gun owners today who maintain the idea of like you don't tell anyone that you have guns because it's a safety thing. But there are plenty who do really involve themselves in kind of the consumerism and the identity of being a gun owner.
Well, Courtney, I think it's a really noble project, and you've got a lot of really smart takes. So thank you so much for sharing it with us today, and I look forward to reading your project when you're all done.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for having me. This has been fun.
Oh, terrific. You're welcome. And for the audience, if you would like more Hagley History Hangouts, more information on the Center for the History of Business, Technology, and Society at the Hagley Museum and Library, join us online. You can visit hagley.org. That's HAGLEY.org. Don't be a stranger.